Bacon and the Modern Dilemma, and it came from the University Press in 1962. Well, the fuss that Eiseley had with the University Press was with Virginia Faulkner, who was the principal management there at that time. But the problems that were caused in the editing of Eiseley's work were caused by a fellow who replaced Amy Jean Tuttle when she retired to homemaking. And so we had that little bit of connection. The edition later came out from Scribner's in 1973, and by this time Eiseley had added 2 more essays to the thing. And it literally hit the market unannounced. I looked in the library and I saw the announcement from the University Press book, which was coming, and it was a very strong statement that this wonderful book was coming, and it never came. And then when Eiseley's second iteration came out, the publishing mechanisms that advertise this stuff just didn't even mention it. Well, now I want to tell you about the Philosophers Club, and you'll see why in a minute. Walter Merrill took me to the Philosophers Club, and I think that Eiseley actually belonged to that at one time. But one of the Philosophers Club at that time was having a problem because they were trying to decide to allow women as members. And I was having the same problem with my club here in Lincoln, where we were talking about the exact same thing. And one of the old fellows across the table from me said to another fellow, he said, "What did you think of those 2 girls we were out with the other night?" And the response was, "Well, I don't know about that one, but I think that Kathy Bowen was all right." Well, Kathy Bowen was Catherine Drinker Bowen, and what Catherine Drinker Bowen had just done is that she had brought out her book on bacon, and the New York Times and anybody else that cared had put it on their top seller lists and so forth and so on, and Eiseley was absolutely furious about that. And I think if he'd had a chance to throttle her, he would have done that. So I think that's an interesting story. Now, the other thing about the Philosophers Club was that night I went with Walter, the speaker was the fellow who had just written the biography of, or the history of the Federal Writers Project, of which Eiseley was involved in a subset in Nebraska. And so it was really exciting to hear that fellow, and his book was a major was a major offering that season. Eiseley reviewed that book in the Philadelphia Inquirer, and I do have a copy of that of his review. Another thing that I did with Walter was I got to go with him to the William Allen bookstore. Well, I might mention that at this era of my life, I was commuting to Philadelphia because my company was in association with a company there, and I was doing all that work with the 2 companies. And so what I could do is I would go to Philadelphia and stay in the Berkeley Hotel and walk to the north to my work site, and then I would turn around at the end of the week and go around the corner to the south and down a couple streets, down a block, and stay with my cousin for a couple of weeks. So we did a lot of things together. And going to the Philosophers Club was one of those things. Another thing we did was we went to the William Allen bookstore. Well, the William Allen bookstore had been one of my favorite bookstores of all time. And Walter was a particularly good friend of William Allen. And William Allen knew Eiseley very, very well. And he told me about how Eiseley would come to his bookstore during a noon hour, and he would spend these elongated noon hours just buried in that bookstore. And the one thing that Allen said was that he never saw him in the science section. He was always in the literature in the section which was at the back of the store. And he'd stay there all this time. I mean, of course, they wouldn't have any conversation or anything like that. Just Eiseley would be buried back in that part of the store. And then at a point in time, he'd just simply leave, and he wouldn't have bought anything. He just walked out empty-handed. But Alan that didn't concern Alan at all, because what Alan knew was that in a couple days, Caroline would come over, and she would have this list of things, and she would be looking for the third book on the fourth shelf and stuff like that. And she walked out, and she was the beast of burden that paid for all those things and carried them back to Eiseley's office. And I've always liked that story. Another thing that I got to do with Walter was to visit the Pennsylvania Academy. Now, you all know that Mabel, before they were married, was the curator of the Nebraska Art Collection, and that was in Morrill Hall. The first weekend I had in Lincoln, I went to Morrill Hall and met Norm Geske and saw the Nebraska things displayed on the second floor of the State Museum. Well, when Mabel and Eiseley were going to get married, of course, she was going to leave, and she had to be replaced, and she was replaced by Dwight Kirsch, who was an instructor. He was an artist himself, and he was an instructor in the art department of the university. Dwight always said that Mabel taught him all that he needed to know to be a curator of a museum, and he was very fond of Mabel. And I think they had connections after the Eisleys left here. Well, of course, Eiseley went to Kansas, and then he went to Oberlin, and then suddenly Frank Speck died, and he went back to take Frank Speck, his mentor's position at the University of Pennsylvania. Well, Dwight Kirsch connected with the Pennsylvania Academy and told them that they should get a hold of Mabel Eiseley, and Mabel Eiseley therefore worked with the Pennsylvania Academy, and she became the number 2 person on her staff. She was right at the top of that thing when they retired. So Mabel got the job. Dwight Kirsch's daughter is someone that I corresponded with about Eiseley matters at one point in time. Another thing I'd like to talk about is Anthropology Today. When Eiseley was first at the University of Pennsylvania, he was put on a committee to plan and oversee a major program that brought famous anthropologists to the University of Chicago, and they all gave papers and so forth and so on. And all of that was published in Proceedings. And Eiseley was on the program committee. Well, later on, maybe 2 or 3 years later, the University of Chicago did a thing that was called Anthropology Today Revisited. And Eiseley was again on that committee, and all of the people that that is, people who were professional anthropologists who attended that meeting, came together for this second session, and it was just a bunch of group discussions where they worked over each of the papers that was given at the original conference and so forth. And Eiseley edited those proceedings. When I was never, that was a book, that was the one Eiseley book I could never get a hold of. And when I went out to Colorado one time for a board meeting that I had out there, I visited again my favorite Boulder bookstore, and there it was. And so I got a copy of that book, and it is in the Heritage Room. Those books were scarce as hen's teeth, and I just couldn't find them. I used all of the resources that I had for book hunting, and I couldn't get a copy of it. Now, the reason I wanted to tell this is because I just think this is so neat. The scholars' comments were recorded like a court reporter would do, and so all of the broken sentences and poor expressions and uhs and ahs and that sort of thing that you would see in conversations that were not planned are just simply recorded the way they fell out. But every time that Eiseley speaks, you will see a pristinely beautiful perfectly expressed little essay, mini essay. It was perfect expression, and of course, those things just stick out like because that's not the way the rest of the book is. And so you'd see this thing with Eiseley, and at the place where the period was, there'd be a little asterisk, and that little asterisk would point you to the bottom of the page, and it would say material submitted subsequently. So Eiseley, who edited the book, made sure that everything he said came off really well. Well, what I'd like to do is close this thing out by talking about a little bit about Caroline Workley. She was a real Southern lady, and she really was one of the Eiseley family. I don't know if Mabel saw her as competition or not, but she was really with the family. She worked with Eiseley for the whole period of his Pennsylvania career. I don't know how they ever got together in the first place, but she was loyal. She did everything for him. You all know the story that after Eiseley's death, Mabel decided to destroy the notebooks that he'd had, and the publisher was very upset and wanted to do what became the notebooks, the Eiseley notebooks. You know the book. And Caroline was able, because she knew Eiseley so well, she was actually able to restore that stuff, because they'd been torn apart, but they hadn't actually gone to the trash. And she was able to put all that back together so that the notebooks could be done. The sad thing about Caroline when we knew her was that she was drifting toward dementia. And she came up here several times, and she really wasn't quite right. You could see what she had been, and she was lovely now, but she wasn't what she had been. As she was coming toward the end, we had no contact with her at all, except we did, because Pat Lyon was a little gal that was a Eiseley fanatic and who came out here for our meetings and who stayed with us longer than we wanted her to at one point in time. Was someone that I corresponded with. I talked to her on the phone a lot, and she was in perfect contact with Caroline, and so we knew exactly what was going on with Caroline. And what actually happened at the end was that she got to such a state that her son brought her up to Dakota, and she died in a facility up there. But we did have contacts with Caroline, because she did come here, and there's a couple stories I wanted to tell you. One was she came and was a speaker for us at one of our sessions that we held at Morrill Hall. And Ruth Thone was real disturbed by her, and she said to me, "You keep your eyes on her, don't you let her get out of your sight," because she was really worried about Caroline wandering off or something like that. And so, of course, I lost contact with Caroline, and I didn't know where she was, and I was really shaken because I didn't know what to do. And so I looked everywhere for Caroline, and I found her out on the front steps of Morrill Hall, standing by one of the columns, and she was looking up into the sky, and she was telling Dr. Eiseley all that was going on that afternoon. Now, another time, she came up here for the purpose of selling her books, and one of her books is over in that thing. You'll see a book where Eiseley has inscribed one of his books to Caroline, and it's in that cabinet that's off to the side there. Caroline had an enormous amount of material. There's material in that cabinet that's over there by the door that came from Eiseley's office. There's also stuff we got from Caroline that day. And so what we had a meeting going on in an Eiseley, one of our Eiseley programs going on in the room upstairs, which is the auditorium room, and off in the boardroom, Jane Geske was appraising these books because Carol Connor had